Hello, welcome to News with a Foreign Accent. This video is going to be about translating Trump. I'm a journalist, I'm second language English, and I've noticed that when I watched news conferences by Donald Trump and he was speaking or he was being translated into other languages other than English, I noticed that the impact of Donald Trump was very different when he was being translated, sort of more statesman-like, less unpredictable. It's almost like the simultaneous translation almost gave Donald Trump this veneer of normality, whereas actually the way he expresses himself in English is quite particular, quite idiosyncratic. My name is Barbara Serra. I've been a journalist for 20 years. I'm a TV news presenter. I've worked for the BBC, Al Jazeera, and Sky News, and I'm one of the very few news presenters on Western media that is second language English. So what I tend to focus on is how using English as a global language impacts the way we see the world, because I think language is culture. I've written extensively on the subject and there are lots of videos. But let's go back to the subject of today, and let me introduce the guest who's with us, Desiree Berlangeri, who is a translator. Desiree, great to have you on.
Hello, thank you for having me.
And I was just talking about the translation of Donald Trump, which obviously is something that you do all the time as part of your job. So start by telling us a little bit about your job, where you work, the languages you work in, and how you started.
Okay, so as you said, my name is Desiree. I've been an interpreter for 20 years, almost 21, and I mainly work on TV. Actually, I work for the Italian Public Broadcasting, RAI, and they have a specific channel that is an all news channel. So what we do is we follow what happens in the world, basically. And whenever there is someone that speaks a different language than Italian, we are there to translate it. It's a team of interpreters that do this. I don't do this alone. We're 6 people, and that's necessary to cover the whole day, basically. So I do not only translate from English, but also from Spanish and French. And the language that I use the most really depends on the geopolitical situation in the world. These days is definitely English. And as for Donald Trump, is my fourth president by now, I think. If we consider that he was president twice and Obama was president twice, so that would be like my seventh president, but still. And again, considering the current situation, we are basically translating him every single day. And in fact, I had a chance, since we translate him so often, to write down many examples that I want to bring up with you to talk about the way we translate him. And I always had a new one because he always comes up with new things. And the last one is always most shocking than the previous one. So basically, this is what I do.
I mean, it's interesting because you and I sort of have very similar jobs, because as a news presenter, as a news anchor, obviously we're taking loads of Donald Trump news conferences. And I have to say that almost everything becomes a news conference with Donald Trump whenever he's getting on or off Air Force One, whether he's going to Mar-a-Lago or going somewhere, he'll have a gaggle of reporters there and he'll just effectively end up having a bit of a news conference. And of course, my job when we take it live as the presenter in the studio when it ends is to up some. So I'm literally kind of, writing down some of the things he says, both the top lines, the topics that he's mentioning, but very often turns of phrase, the exact words that he uses, because they're so particular. You do something similar but different because, of course, as he's speaking, you are interpreting his words. So I suppose the first question I'm going to ask you, you've said you've translated for quite a few presidents. What are the particular things with Trump? What are the words? What are the phrases? What have you sort of had to get your head around over the past, well, not just this year, but his previous term as well?
Okay. So I noticed some differences from the very beginning. Even during his first term, he was very disruptive in his way of communicating. He departs from traditional political speeches. First of all, because he comes from a different world. He always says himself that he's a businessman. That's where he comes from. And he never dreamt of getting into politics until the country needed him to do so. So again, he's very, very disruptive, but it's like He doesn't use, he says repeatedly that he doesn't write his own speeches or nobody else does it for him. In fact, he doesn't even follow a teleprompter like other
It's
presidents
rare that he does. Yeah.
used to do in the past. And so he basically uses all these punchlines. It's like watching commercials or something that has more to do with emotions than with politics.
But there's
Usually,
words, right? Like beautiful is one. Big,
absolutely.
almost like
Hmm.
quite simple words, actually.
Simple words, and you use them all the time. Bad, tremendous, terrific, disaster, disgrace. That's what he uses all the time. And these words sound simple in English as they do in Italian. And since he repeats them so much, sometimes I have to change them. I have to find synonyms because otherwise it would be too repetitive in Italian. And also, it's kind of different from the way Italian politicians speak. Now, this doesn't mean that I change the message or what he says, because the job of interpreter, our task is to be as invisible as possible. And, there's always the dilemma of what it's called in the literature, the beautiful and faithful. If you improve the language to make it sound more beautiful, but is less faithful to the original source or the original message,
Mm.
or you leave it as it is because that's what people say. And we tend to do the second. We leave it as it is. I don't want to change what people say. But sometimes I should say I choose maybe a different register because it's still the president of the United States. So, for instance, to give you an example, live on TV, I'm not allowed to use swear words. I cannot say them. So, whenever he says something, and he said it many times, like, can I say them now? Like
Of course you can.
bullshit.
We're online. We're not on TV.
Yeah.
Feel free here.
So, whenever he says something like bullshit or crap or stuff like that, I have to change it a little bit. But also
Because you're
simpler
broadcasting on the main feed.
exactly. It also depends on what time of the day it is. Just I don't think children watch the news, but still, there is a code that we have to follow. But also other words like stupid that he uses that all the time. Whenever he refers to Biden, for instance, he says it was the stupidest president ever. And that's sometimes I say stupid, which is basically the same word in Italian, but some other times I would say silly rather than stupid. But then again, there are some other sentences that we know it's like his own brand. So I either sometimes I leave them in English or I translate them literally. For instance, the one that he likes very much, drill baby drill, that wouldn't make any sense in Italian. So I just leave it in English and people would know what that is. Or the name of the laws that he comes up with, like the one
The
big
big
beautiful
beautiful bill.
bill. Exactly. I leave that in English because it wouldn't make any sense in Italian.
See, that's so interesting. But I think there's almost two separate issues, right? One is, my whole idea is that language is culture, right? That you're never just speaking a language, that basically you have to translate what it means, I mean, in anything. And so I appreciate that you have to change certain things to make them make sense to a non-English speaking audience. But interestingly, the impression I get when I watch Donald Trump on Italian TV is that he's not quite, and I don't know what the word, I mean, I don't want to say normal, but the way that he speaks in English is so idiosyncratic. He has this strange turn of phrase. It's quite a simplistic way of speaking. He uses quite almost childlike language sometimes, very simple, to get through. I mean, obviously it must work because he's there for the second term. But I suppose sometimes I watch him on Italian TV or other TVs, and I just think that's not the full Trump. And you said it yourself that sometimes you slightly embellish the language. So I'm just
I
wondering,
do.
eh, but don't you feel that that gets in the way of the real Trump coming across? So how do you think that would impact the viewers?
Probably, yes. It probably changes a little what Trump really is when he speaks English. But you also have to consider there's another process going on as we translate. That is not something that is staged or is prepared or I know what he's going to say beforehand. So I'm also translating right there. And the other dilemma with Trump is that besides the language that he chooses to use, is like, did I understand correctly what he said? Did he
Oh,
really
we all
say
have
that?
to, even in English.
Or
that
Or did I
sometimes.
misunderstand? Or they really said that? So you have to combine all those elements together. And then, yeah, you're probably right. Sometimes we do polish them a little. Yeah, probably I do it for the audience because we are used to listen to politicians speaking in a different way, probably.
You mean when you say we, do you mean you in Italy, or do you think all of us
Italian
understand
audience.
the language? Okay. Because I mean, I
No, I
know
think
that,
mhm.
I mean, you could argue that Trump himself has changed the way that politicians speak. You know, we're kind of seeing that way, the way that politicians are communicating everywhere is changing. I mean, I'm just wondering because sometimes the words that he uses are so they're basic, you know, and that in a way is his
Mhm.
communicative strength. Do you ever worry that the audience is going to think that you're using those basic words because maybe you, I don't
I don't know
know the
better. Yeah.
sophisticated way of saying something else?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes I do worry that people think that I am using my own words, that those are my words, which are not, of course. But then people, I mean, in the end, they will know it's not me. And probably they will appreciate that I am using the same register that the speaker is using. And this is true for Trump and many other people as well. There are people that are not used to speaking in public, and sometimes they freeze or they lose their train of thoughts. And so they turn to a more basic language, and it's also a strategy to be understood better by more people. So I mean, I think part of that effort is conscious. It's not just this definitely is a style, but I think there's a little bit of strategy in that too.
Oh, no, I mean, a sort of emotional simplicity in a sense, you know, to connect with.
Hmm. Emotions is the key word there. He really bases everything on emotions. He says, and then he uses hyperboles so much. It's so everything is a disaster. Everything is extremely bad, tremendous, terrific. It's not slightly bad or something that can be improved. Everything is an hyperbole with him. Even numbers and data. Everything is always exaggerated. He's always the best president in history, in the history of humanity, not even in the history of the United States. So he has the most beautiful signature. He knows everything. Like if he wanted to do something, he would do it, but he doesn't have the time to do it. A few days ago, actually, he was chairing a meeting with all the leaders from South America. And actually, he paid so many compliments to interpreters because he said that all you need is a good interpreter because he doesn't have the time to learn a new language. He said he won't learn Spanish, so he said, all you need is an interpreter. But I was good at languages, he said. If I wanted to learn Spanish, I could in a couple of months, but I just don't have the time for it. So
Okay.
so everything with him is the best and perfect and the best possible thing on
Yeah.
earth.
In fairness, he's not one for nuance, is he, Donald Trump?
No, no.
Uh, but listen, I mean, you know, you work in news as a translator. I've been working in news, you know, for years and years. But the past couple of weeks, of course, we have been at war, and the whole start of this year, you know, has been, you know, first Venezuela, then
Yeah.
Finland, and now, well, the United States and Israel and Iran are certainly at war, and it seems to be expanding. And it's a time when actually the language used, I find, is really important because, of course, you know, I mean, war is horrific because of its impact. But I have noticed just the language around it. Some of the things, I mean, don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to get political on it, but, you know, the White House released this video that was much criticized, you know, where war was turned into a Hollywood film effectively. And some of the language as well coming out from Hegseth, who is the Secretary for Defense or Secretary for War, as he restyled himself. So, what have you made of the language that they've been using? If you've noticed a difference around this war, so particularly over the past few weeks?
Absolutely. Yes. They're using more sentences or references that come from war movies. And a comedian in Italy said a few years ago that Americans go to war because they want to make movies about them later. So probably. And I also read an article a few days ago that talked about the minification of war. So it's either, again, I guess part of it is strategy to make it more digestible for people, more acceptable to people. And part of it is just their way of communicating. Even before the war, think of all the AI videos that the White House account posted on Trump, like it was on a plane, dropping feces on protesters because he didn't agree with him, or anytime somebody is in disagreement with him, then he does something with AI or makes fun of them. He makes fun of Macron all the time. He speaks with a French accent. He says that he's going to leave office
So
soon,
here's a
so we don't care
question,
what he
just
says.
as someone who literally, my newsletter is called News with a Foreign Accent, so a lot of people listening to this will have foreign accents in English, obviously, second language English. How would you translate Donald Trump making fun of Macron's French accent in Italian? How do you do it?
Oh,
How do you do it?
I would fake a French accent in Italian. That is doable. Yeah, I would do that because otherwise there's no other way of understanding. So he speaks English with a French accent, and I would speak Italian with a French accent to make people understand. But sometimes he does the French accent. Some other times he just mocks him another way. So
Yeah, that's
mhm,
amazing. And I was going to ask you about also because you said there's few of you that do this job. I mean, I first of all
mhm.
say that I find continuous translating the most amazing thing. I mean, I've been bilingual since I was 9 years old, but I would find it so difficult to just simultaneously. I can kind of do it if I can interview someone in two languages, but even that is different to um to just speaking. So you have all my admiration and your colleagues as
Thank
well.
you,
And I was
thank you.
wondering whether you talk about these things with your colleagues, because I do think, I mean, I take your point. You're effectively saying, look, to translate, it's a cultural thing, right? It can't just be always a literal translation. You have to adapt so that the audience understands, because that's the whole point of all of us. We're all in communication. You have to make the audience understand, but there is a slight risk of embellishing what he's saying just because that's not what we're here for. Just wondering if you talk about it with your colleagues, if it's something that you guys are talking about now more, especially in the second Trump term where he seems to be, is certainly more active, isn't he?
We do, absolutely. And also because it's good to have a common vocabulary for translating Trump, especially when it comes to I remember even before he became president, because what we do before the elections is we translate the presidential debates. There are usually three. This last year, there was a change. It was Biden first, then Kamala Harris came up. And especially when he finds nicknames for people, we talk to each other to have the same translation for those, like Sleepy Joe or Laughing Kamala was particularly hard to find a translation for because you have to find something that is just as effective in Italian and possibly encompasses the same cultural references that he's
I'm sure
using.
this is going to cut out the non-Italian speakers, but there will be some
I
easy.
know.
What did you land on for Sleepy Joe and Camel?
Well, Sleepy Joe was not particularly brilliant. We just say Joe l'addormentato, which
Okay,
is,
Sleepy Joe.
but we thought something like on the line of Sleeping Beauty, but Sleeping Joe, but it was a Sleepy Joe, not Sleeping Joe. So we didn't find anything brilliant. But the discussion was more about Kamala. There would be we came up with something like Kamala Giuliva, which sounds like. A goose, which in Italian is something that is it's ridiculous and it's silly, and it's usually a woman. So we do have discussions about that so that we have a common vocabulary when it comes to, especially Trump, because with other presidents, it wasn't really necessary. And also, you usually get to know your speakers, especially when they're in a role for a long time, like the presidents of the United States. They stay there for 4 years. And so with Obama, for instance, or even Bush or Biden, you kind of anticipate their sentences. You could finish the sentences before they do because you know what they're going to say. With Trump is never the case. Because you don't know what he's going at, you don't know what he's going to talk about next. Because as you might have seen, one day, like 1 minute is talking about the war in Iran, the next minute is talking about how to embellish the ballroom that is building in the White House. So, how do you combine all these things together? And also, it's so it leaves you like flabbergasted sometimes. It's so weird because, for instance, I was translating him for the opening of the General Assembly of the UN. And he started off, that teleprompter wasn't working. So he started talking about how the escalator in the hall of the building didn't work and Melania almost fell, and how he had proposed a plan to renew the building for $5 million, and then they spent
Yeah.
10 times more. And then he was talking about the quality of the marble. He mentioned very specific marble types because, again, he comes from building industry, so he knows. And at that point, you're like, again, am I understanding correctly? Or or just, you're so out of it that you're like, is this really what I have to say now?
Can I ask you something? Because,
Sure.
I mean, without giving away too many details, I don't want to say you're my second choice for interview because you absolutely aren't. But I did get in touch with another simultaneous translator before you because I'd seen something that they'd done on some newspaper. So I sent an email saying, would you like to talk about it, blah, blah, blah. And they replied to me saying lovely things about the newsletter and journalism in general, blah, blah, blah. But they said that they had had so much negative feedback, so many, I think they even mentioned threats because they had spoken about some of the ways in which Trump is. So this poor person who's a simultaneous translator and was literally just talking about their job started getting threats when this article was published because, as we all know, we live in pretty heightened times, and Donald Trump is very controversial. Politics right now is incredibly divisive, and I have to say that really shocked me. As journalists, unfortunately, we've kind of become slightly well. We should always be used to it, but certainly in the past few years. But it surprised me that shooting the messenger even extended to shooting the instantaneous translator, figuratively speaking. I'm just wondering whether you are ever worried. I don't want to say scared, but do you ever think about the words that, not that you're putting in his mouth, but the way, do you worry about translating him more than you worry about translating other people?
Yes and no, because I mean, as you said, we live in a very polarized world. So if people want to find something to criticize you, they will do it, they will find it. So I'm sure people will find something to say about this interview as well. And it's fine. I mean, everybody's entitled to their own opinions.
Yeah.
Here, I'm not talking about politics. I'm not talking his political stance. I'm talking about how difficult it is to follow his speeches because, again, he departs so much from traditional political speeches and he uses basic vocabulary. And so I've come to terms with that by now. Again, that's his second term. Although I have to say, in this second term, everything is more extreme than it used to be in the
Yeah.
first one. It's like it was a rehearsal back then, and now it's the real thing. But I do understand that some people are scared because, of course, we work on TV. This is broadcasted on TV. What I translate, and I know that the audience can be quite vast. Of course, I don't see them all like when I'm in a conference room doing conference interpreting, and so I'm really careful about what I say. But again, that's his words, not mine. My job is to convey a message, not to express opinions. And that's exactly, I mean, I'm not doing that whatsoever when I translate him.
Okay. I'm gonna almost coming to the end. I'm gonna ask you, what your like top three, four, five Trumpisms are to translate. But I also just wanted to ask you about others. I mean, Pete Hegseth is another one, and
Mhm.
actually a former Fox News presenter, obviously a broadcaster, someone who's very used and comfortable to the camera, and speaking in that way. And there's one phrase that really stuck with me, Leo, about the war: in it to win it. So is Trump a particular challenge, or is that kind of language now seeping into the rest of the administration, where you're finding more and more politicians in the United States, whether it's the administration or just in general, that it's actually changing what we see as acceptable or normal or even statesman like language? And I'm thinking Pete Hegseth, but it could be anybody.
Mhm. Yeah, probably his administration, his ministers, the people around him tend to speak like him, but it's a little different than, first of all, because we do not translate the accent as often as we do with Trump. I have translated him maybe a couple of times, and he's speaking more now because he's the Secretary of War. So again, because of what's going on, he has like, I think, daily press conferences. For instance, I have translated Rubio way more than Exit. And he does speak like Trump a little bit, but you can tell that his speeches have a different architecture. There is a thesis, then he explains details, and then it comes to the end, which is the synthesis of what he said from the beginning, whereas with Trump, that never happens. As for references, yes, probably they do make references to, again, war movies and such, but I don't worry about those much because either you translate it, you know exactly what they're talking about, and you know exactly how it was translated in Italian, which most often is not the case for me, or you just translate it literally, and people will understand where it comes from. So it's fine. But also, what I noticed is that for instance, I remember when Obama was not president yet, when he was still a senator, he was still receiving some attention from the media. So we would translate him a little bit. And then when he became president, he changed his way of speaking completely. But what I mean here is that he knew he was speaking to an international audience.
Ah.
For instance, if I translate people like Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, their English is way different because they're not speaking to international audiences. They're using less of a global English, as you called it before, than what presidents do. And that was true for Bush, that was true for Obama, that was true for Biden. Again, it's not true for Trump. He doesn't care who he's speaking to. He always uses the same language. He doesn't care not doesn't care, but maybe doesn't take into consideration, it's a better definition, of the history of the country. A couple of days ago, I was translating him, and he had the Prime Minister of Japan on a state visit,
Oh
and he
yeah.
mentioned Pearl Harbor.
Oh, he did.
And at that time, we were not broadcasting anymore. We were out of it, but I was still listening. And I noticed how the prime minister absolutely froze because that's not something you mention when Japanese are in the room, Pearl Harbor. And then he was speaking also about the element of surprise. And we're talking about nuclear bombs here, and Japan knows something about it. So it's something that you expect from Trump, but nobody else would mention.
But so Desiree, that's really interesting because effectively what you're saying is that he doesn't adapt his language
No,
and
no.
other politicians will speak one way to a domestic audience, another when they have an international one. He just kind of like has one way of speaking. But then I suppose my question to you is, do you find that in your work as a translator, then you end up being the one adapting his language from like domestic anyone to international audience? Because otherwise your own non-American, non even Anglophone audience is not going to understand him, not so much the words, but the sort of the culture behind them. Do you find that you have to do more of the cultural work behind translations because he doesn't do any of it?
Well, if I had to translate it, if I had to do a written translation, I would probably do more adaptation and explanation. On simultaneous interpreting, you don't have the time to do that much. Sometimes I would add a little bit of explanation, but it's not even my job. So, I mean, journalists are supposed to do that, not interpreters. So maybe what happens then, it's at the end, the journalist who has to do the upsum, as you do, would explain things a little better if there was something that wasn't clear.
But do the journalists rely on your translation, or are they hearing him, in his own authentic?
Um, it depends. Some of them, those who speak English, listen to the original source.
Yeah, because I mean, you have to. I mean, I'm sure they all speak relatively good English, but if you're gonna,
Yeah, especially the one that are at the foreign desk. Yes. Hmm.
yeah. Okay. So that's, I suppose the final question then would be, do you think you hear him in English, you understand him in English, Donald Trump? Do you think that your audience, in this case, an Italian speaking audience that doesn't hear him in English, gets the full Trump? Or do you think that this
Mm,
veneer of the simultaneous translation ultimately changes the impact that people have of him?
no, I don't think it changes the impact because his speeches, even if they're translated, they always come with a journalist comment Or again, he makes headlines and then all the newspapers talk about it. So even if something was missed during the simultaneous translation or was changed a little bit to polish it, let's say, then there would be something in the headlines or newspapers then explain how it really was. So I think no, that people see the real Trump.
You think so?
Hmm.
Okay. All right. And just I keep on saying the final point, but I keep on coming up with questions to ask you. So just culturally, just give us an example of, because a lot of people watching now will be, bi trilingual. Um, and we'll know the cultural differences, the bits that you miss. So for example, one of the topics that I talk about quite extensively apart from language is fascism, right? And I actually talk about fascism to an Italian
Hmm.
audience, the country where the term was coined and that had a fascist dictatorship for 20 years. Obviously they will have a knowledge and understanding, a personal experience of it, which would be very different if you're speaking to an Anglophone audience that doesn't have that history and that, first-hand knowledge. So culturally speaking, what are the topics that you're finding now in the Trump administration that kind of touch on that, if you can think of any?
Well, there is one thing that we also discussed a little bit that is religion. There are so many references to religion, which might sounds weird for an Italian audience. Like people think of Italy as a very Catholic country, which it is on paper. Like I think 90, maybe even 95% of the population is Catholic, but religion never filters through the political speech as much or as bluntly as it does with Trump. Like Trump sometimes makes a press conference from a prayer event, or we've all seen the images of him sitting in the middle and people putting hands on his head or shoulders and everybody praying for the positive outcome of whatever he's praying for. So religion is something that is more present now. I mean, we all know that all the political speeches from American presidents end with "God bless America," which sounds weird to an Italian audience, but it's now more present in his discourse than it used to be. As much as war in general and how we don't need to be as politically correct as we used to be because that didn't work, so we can take our gloves off and everything goes.
Yeah, I mean that's super interesting because of course in Italy there's the separation of church and state because we have the Vatican, which is
Well,
a different state, but wasn't up until not that long ago. Interestingly, in the UK, the king is the head of the church as well, right? So every country will have its different way of handling a religion. All right, Desiree, it's been great speaking to you. Something tells me that we may well speak again because the subject of Trump never goes away in the way that he uses language. But thank you so much, and thank you all for watching. Anyone who has, their own examples of translations that haven't quite worked or that you think gave the strange or different or wrong even impression of Donald Trump in your experience, please put it in comments and I will definitely engage with them. I would love to hear you. Thank you for watching. Desiree, thanks again. Bye-bye.
thank you. Bye.